right, I think I'm next. I didn't know if we're doing much between them or just go straight in.
Just go. It's
Okay. All right. Let's see here. Let me get this right here and right window. Okay. So ideally, everybody can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking about making modules. This is actually a talk that I had given previously at the Perl and Raku conference down in Houston, but I think also redoing it, kind of representing it to a purely Raku audience, has some value to it. Because I think one of the very important things that one of the things I find to be very important right now, early in the Raku ecosystem, is I want us to kind of all be kind of trying to make very high quality modules, all kind of trying to follow, certain, I don't want to say standards because, they're Tim Toady, but, so that when people are developing tools like Raku Land and things like that, or when users want to start depending on our modules, that we're actually providing everything that they need, and we're not having these sort of super crazy out there APIs and ways to work with modules. And so I think as those of us who are creating modules, and I know that many of us already do this, think about how we can make our modules better for other people and benefit the whole Raku community. So in this talk, I'd like to start from very beginning to the very end. So we're going to start off with just what is a module? Why do we want them? How can it help other people? How do we use them? How do we share them? And then finally, what is Fez?
Sorry to interrupt you, but we don't see actually what you're sharing. It's just white stripe.
Oh, I think it's because I moved the window. Can you see it now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Oh, okay. I moved, dragged the window to my other monitor. Apparently, Zoom did not like that. Noted for future. Anyway, so yeah, this is the organization of the talk here. So first off, what is a module? Well, it's reusable code. It's generally precompiled. Obviously, we have the option, we can say not to precompile it if we want. And it can be as simple as a custom sort routine. In fact, actually, I think Liz has, I'm not going to quite say the monopoly on these sort of very super focused modules to do certain things, but they're really useful when you need them. And you don't want to have to go and repeat code. And she does a really great job of these. But they can also be as complex as, like a full service web services library, or, all sorts of other things. And we've already heard people talk, about Red. We also know about Crow, although Jonathan didn't talk about it this time. And so we can have very, very, very complex modules as well. So why would we want them? Well, for the speedy, right? They are precompiled. It goes faster, right? But it's also a different type of speed. Yeah, there's the performance benefit, but there's also the programming performance benefit in the sense that you only have to write it once. And why do we want to write things twice, right? This is why most of us go into programming, right? So that we can get stuff done a lot faster, the programmer mentality, engineering mentality. So we have speed things up down the road. Another big advantage of using modules is, yeah, you can use this code across multiple projects, but that also means then that code has hopefully, ideally, been fairly battle tested, right? When you're using a module, or like when you use the built-in date time in Raku, you just can assume that it works and it's going to work correctly because it has been very thoroughly tested, and people have been relying upon it, and you can trust that it's going to continue to work as you expect it to. And so, you know, if you are using somebody's module and you know that it's been used in lots of other projects, or even in your own projects, and you've given your own testing, then it's it's a lot safer for you. And of course, it makes your code cleaner and more maintainable. You don't have to update code in 10 different places for that custom sort routine that you wanted. You put it in one place and you just use that little use and you're all good to go. And of course, then, like I said, it saves time. And then how can it benefit other people? Well, all of the exact same reasons, right? And so this is why when people are making modules for themselves, it's also a good idea to think how you might be able to benefit other people with your code. And I know sometimes beginners are thinking, well, there's not anything that they can contribute to the ecosystem. How can this benefit others? And I think we've already found, I can't remember who it was, had about like a month or two ago, it just started kind of using Raku and did something with macOS. I can't remember exactly what it was. Anyway, publish it out. It's a great module and it's a really useful one. And so sometimes people can come up with things and then we don't have to repeat it, don't have to figure those things out. So how we're gonna get into now how we make and use modules. And so we're gonna get into the anatomy of a module, how we deal with exports, how we can give it a little bit of polish. And this is where I'm really talking about things that we want to do. Those of us who are really making modules that'll be used by the community, setting up our Meta 6, and handling other sorts of imports when we actually want to use the module. So the anatomy of a module. This is sort of the most important parts that we have in our modules. Sometimes I think it's almost a little bit easier to lay it out like this and just kind of look at each different one, because sometimes that help file just kind of, you scroll down for 3 or 4 pages with the descriptions of it. So we have the Meta 6 file, and this is just literally describes, it's all the metadata, hence it's called meta, right, about our module, tells us everything. Then you've got the lib directory, and this is where we actually put our module file, the actual Raku code that we'll be using. What's interesting is the structure here isn't actually that important if you've set up things properly in the Meta 6 file, which I'm going to get into. And so if you just use like a use lib, then that folder structure is actually important. But you could have it a completely flat file and then have, you know, multiple namespaces set up in the Meta 6 file, or vice versa. You could have the Meta 6 be very flat and the actual directory structure fairly hierarchical. Then we have two separate test files. We have T and XT. And this is actually a nice little distinction to have, because when you run the test files in T, when you install a module, when you go in on the command line, you say zef install insert module name, it will run every single test file in T. And sometimes those can take a lot of time, especially if you have a lot of test files, which ideally everybody should have. I'm very guilty of not having them. But if they take a very long time to run, then what you can do instead is take some of those that maybe aren't as necessary for testing for the install purpose, but maybe are more better tests to do for development purposes that are much more detailed or much more extensive, and you can throw those into the XT folder instead. And they won't be run at install time, but they can still be tested by the developer to make sure things are working. And so I kind of skipped those two others. Here we have Readme, which is, I think, fairly self-explanatory. Most people do this in Markdown because it displays rather nicely in like Raku Land or in GitHub, which is where we were originally hosting a lot of our files for the ecosystem. Then we have the resources folder, and I think this is one that has been fairly misunderstood. I know that Nick has definitely corrected me on this one for how I had been using it, and I've seen a lot of other people have the same issues when they're doing their modules. Resources is just a place to put files that you will need to use at some point in your module's lifecycle, either compile time, because it is put in at compile time, or principally at runtime. But the important thing to remember is this is not going, these files are not being put in their file structure. And so while they might look like, when you access them with this resources hash, they might look like they're IO objects, and therefore you could potentially ask it for, you know, children files and things like that. They are not installed that way. And so you can't try to traverse any of that directory at all. These really should just be for single named files, and they'll be referenced in the meta6 file. I actually have a module where I was trying to do some very weird things to, at runtime, determine the contents of the resources folder. It is not designed to do that. And you have to do some really weird things that I'm not entirely certain are future-proofed code to do that. If you potentially have some dynamic-ish content in that resources folder, like I have in a lot of my international modules, like international CLDR, pulls in data from the CLDR project and has a whole list of every single language files, has sort of a data file and a strings file for each one. And each release that I have, those are going to be changing. I don't want to have to go in and modify the meta6 to do, or my code or anything like that. So what I do is I have a script, it runs in, it creates a single file that says, hey, here are the languages we have, and then I can access that one at runtime. And I find that works a lot better. But I wouldn't store other things in there. I used to store some of my tools that I would have, like build tools, other things like that, and resources, and the folder is really not designed for that. Then we've got the license. Right, put your text of that license in there. Yes, it's included in your meta6 file, hopefully, but it's also good to have that. Again, that will be displayed in a lot of different programs like Raku Land or in GitHub, so that people, as they're browsing through, can quickly see which licenses we're using. You have a bin folder. This is used for any kind of binary code that you need. A lot of times when you're doing wrapper libraries, I think David Warren has a lot of these with the PDF stuff. Those will all get put into that bin folder. You can reference ones that are already on the system, but sometimes you just need code on there. I have on my user, what is it, for the user date time one, I think it is, or the user language, I compile quickly like a little binary for Windows or on Mac for that particular edition. Those get stored in there. Then we have the doc. I don't know why we call this one doc and not docs. Perhaps somebody who was there back in the day can explain this one. I feel like it should be plural, but I double checked in synopsis and everything. It is doc singular. But that's where you can put anything beyond your README. Then we have these two, or well, these bottom three right here. These are really not going to be used at runtime, but they're definitely used at other processes of the module install process or in development. And so the build and hooks, again, not really sure why they used hooks for this directory. I think build / would have been more appropriate, but that's what's in the synopses. And this is stuff that you need when you are installing the module and it needs to get built. So again, this might be a process where you have those libraries, those binary libraries. You can, set it up so that it, pulls in whatever compiler it needs, compiles the code. Maybe it grabs different system stats, and those system stats aren't things that you want to be having to grab every single time at runtime. Maybe you can just grab it here at build time, throw it in for the compile, I don't know, whatever things you might need there, and you just throw it in that hooks folder, any of the code that you need for that running process. And then we have tools. This is actually not a standard one, but it's one that I've started using, I suppose in large part because I have a lot of a lot of tools to automate things in my modules, but to me, it's a nice folder to kind of separate it out and say, hey, this is stuff you're using as you're developing, kind of getting ready to push stuff out, but not actually in the builder install process. So I would propose for people to use that if they have such tools in their projects. All right, so now we know what we have in our module. Okay, well, how do we decide what we want to export? This is another one of those things where there's a couple of different ways that we do it, right, Tim Toady? There are very good advantages and disadvantages to doing certain methods. So our easiest way is to use an export trait. So here we see like subfoo is export, or our bar is export. And this trait also takes arguments, which allows us to group them, right? So if we say like use foo, we would just get the foo. Yes, expert, not export. You made me doubt myself there, Liz. And so this can be a quick way to help people drop in different types of, you don't have to have a one size fits all for what the module is exporting. You can imagine where if you have a math module that has, I don't know how many hundreds of different functions, maybe you only want to import some of the trig ones, maybe you only want, certain rational functions or something. I don't know. I'm not a super math person. But this is a very simple, but very effective way to do the imports. There's a reason that this is sort of the standard way that we show beginners to do things, because honestly, it covers 95% of the exports that you'll do. I think I only have maybe one or two modules where I have to do anything special, and I don't use this format. And I think most people who have made modules will kind of agree. There's no reason to rewrite the book. They've made the defaults in Raku very great. But one thing I find is not everybody uses this trait argument for doing selective importing or exporting of the symbols. And I think this is one thing that we should try to think about more, especially as we start getting a much more robust ecosystem, because the more modules that we have and the more useful ones that we have that people want to combine in really awesome ways, the higher we have a chance for symbol clashes. And there's certainly ways to deal with that, but I don't want to deal with that in my code. And so if I can avoid importing certain ones to avoid that symbol clash, I'd rather do it. Okay, well, another way that we can do this is to use the export sub to enable arguments. Now, one key thing about this one, and this threw me off for a little while when I first was starting to use this, is you don't use a module foo or a unit module foo if you're using the export sub. You just throw it directly into the file, nothing else, just the one sub there in the file. And in this case, you can actually very explicitly state, take this variable, take this, thing that's sitting in memory and plop it in using this name. And yeah, right, Liz, exactly. Liz is saying, see the from module to handle symbol clashes. As I said, she has the monopoly on these amazing single use modules. But here we can choose exactly which names we want to export these symbols at. And you might think that this is the same as using that is export. But the key thing is we are actually in a Raku sub here. We're in Raku code, which means we can handle this dynamically. I could actually set up these names. If I wanted to, I could set the name based on the date. That would probably cause all sorts of compile errors, but I mean, you could do it. But what's nice about that one, actually, what's nice about that one is you can pass variables on. And so instead of using those named variables that we used for the export trait, users pass positional ones, and we can use that as our sort of configuration information that they might want. And you can actually kind of combine that you can do with this my package export, and you can see then again, so those named ones, default or export, and then you set up the different variables in there. I have not found a whole lot of utility for that one in my personal modules, but as soon as I say that, somebody's going to go into chat and say, well, this is exactly when the perfect time to use it is. So somebody put it in there, so I have a good example of when this is more useful. But yeah, these methods are both more powerful, but they are definitely more complicated. And with that complexity comes tools struggling with them. So I do have this, use the sub export in one of my modules, and it's actually a little frustrating because comma at the current moment of August 13th, 2022 does not know how to handle that. And if you try to use a symbol that's been exported that way, it will say, oh, this is unknown symbol, I don't know how to handle it. And it really only handles those that had the is export trait. I think it will handle the my package one, but it does not know how to do that dynamic one because I don't think it wants to run that code beforehand. All right, so how can we give our modules a little bit of polish? Well, there's a couple of questions here that we might want to ask ourselves. And this is again where I was really saying, I want those of us who are writing modules, especially those who are writing modules that we anticipate large use, Red, Crow, international modules, things like that. Really think through this, but I think it's also nice to go through it on some smaller modules too, to kind of get practice, at least getting into the thinking mode for it. And so that's first I would say, what does your module do? We don't want to do scope creep. I've already been through this with some of my modules, and I started realizing that scope was creeping, and I ended up breaking apart into different modules and separating out duties, separating out functions. You know, it's the way, right, that importing modules in and compiling them. If you've got a gigantic module, maybe you don't want somebody to have to use the whole thing. Maybe you can actually separate it out into 2 or 3 different modules so they only use what they need. A big question for me is, how might others interact with your module? And this is one of those things where you think, okay, well, if I am allowing some particular feature, say like that Liz mentioned, you know, this from module to handle symbol clashes. Well, I could imagine, without having looked inside of the code on it or remember exactly how it works, I can think of a couple of different ways that could be handled. Maybe it could be handled imperatively with a little sub call. Maybe it could be handled via traits. Maybe it could be, you know, handled via arguments to that module import or the use statement. So there's a couple of different ways that people might want to use it. You know, do you want to provide things as you know, subs or as methods? There's especially things for regexes. There's a lot of too many ways almost to import those in and handle them. So think that through and think like, what is the most optimal way for people to do it? Or maybe you want to provide 2 or 3 different options. As I think, you know, me and Daniel kind of were going back and forth on this, on different ways that, you know, you could have somebody use a grammar within a grammar. And I think, what did we end up coming with, like 5 or 6 different ways that we could accomplish the same task in terms of the API, because at the core, most of it was kind of working the same way, but just how people would maybe want to use it, where they want to put the information. And it's just one of those things to think through. There's not a right or wrong answer on them, but give it some thought. So things on there is, right, following standard naming conventions. Please don't use like Hungarian variable naming. In Raku, we have Unicode. We can have long variable names. You know, don't use Pascal case where Raku would use kebab case. Little things like that, it feels almost patronizing to remind it, but it really does help when you're using a module and you don't have to put that little extra bit of thought process. Wait, does this module use this convention or that other one? Again, Tim Toady, it's great, but there's certain other little things that maybe we should standardize. One big one that I found is when you have certain subs, it's actually a really good idea to express them as multis, even if in your module they aren't. And a really good example of this is in JSON Tiny. There's the toJSON function. Now this one is actually multi in the original one, but if I have my own custom class and I want to define its JSON serialization, I can just add in a new multi candidate of toJSON inside parentheses with my custom class in there. And so a lot of times allowing that multi or putting it in there can really make life easier for people who are using the module. Being nice to IDEs, typing is one of these. I get it. Raku is a gradually typed language. We can pretty much ignore types 99% of the time if we want to. But if we have functions that we write and we actually define what the return value is, then code completion is greatly enhanced inside of comma, for instance. And so if you use, if you have an object and you use a method on it and you're typing in dot whatever, if that return value is typed and comma can infer what it should be, then as soon as you hit another dot and you're chaining the methods, it will pull up the correct set of candidates. But if you don't put in the return value, which is not, of course, not required, then it won't know what to do and it'll just have to treat it as a generic object. So little things like that, a little bit of extra polish. I know it's not necessary when you're first writing it, but maybe on your second or third kind of pass or rewrite can be really great. Test files. This is a do as I say, not as I do. I'm getting much better. And I think a lot of us, because we're early on in the ecosystem, we want to get our modules out there and get them done and have them ready for people to use. But if those modules are going to be used long term, test files, they're really important. And honestly, a lot of times I find the test files to be really enlightening. How did the author kind of think that their module would be used? I've been playing with Raku AST on this one, and where I learned most of my Raku AST was looking at the test files for it. So definitely it's a really great way to kind of see it used a little bit more. Another thing here is to use extended names for your modules. Again, right, it's not actually required. We can just say use foo. But for a variety of different reasons, right, when we were thinking through, when I say we as if I were a participant in it, it was before my time, when folks were thinking through how modules were going to work. Yes, there's also the API one. I was running out of space. I didn't want to break it onto 2 lines. But make sure to use at least within your module, make sure you're calling the exactly correct version of that module that is needed. Because there's certainly some security concerns that could be involved in there if it ends up calling a different module, but also just in general stability and making life easier for everybody. So get into a habit of doing that. But certainly when you're writing a module, even more so than in normal code, I would say this is a place that you need to use those extended names for your modules. And document. Again, I know nobody likes to write documentation. That's why we have a whole separate crew, I think, that's writing a lot of people that write the documentation are not the core developers. There's nothing wrong with that. I get it's sort of very different skills, but documentation the more you assume that your module is going to get used, document it more. And a lot of times it can just be, I find it easiest if I have my test files, explain your test files, and then just delete the test part of it. And now you have paragraphs for documentation. You know, if you're doing testing on how this works with integers, okay, explain how does it work with integers, you know, or for a formatting file for my like date time format. You know, here's my giant test file for how date time stuff is being formatted. Okay, explain each of those. And now I have a documentation file. And again, again, that actually helps the IDEs because many of them can read in that documentation, particularly if you use the declarator pod. And so somebody can hover over something, especially again, if you've defined like the return type, they'll tell you, oh, hey, this is what this method is. This is what it returns. And this is how that returned object works. And so I get it. If you do all this polish, even on what would otherwise be like a 10-line module, all of a sudden your file is literally has 100 lines more text in it. But it's nice. It's good for the users. And when we have new people coming into Raku, they can see that and say, oh, wow, people really care about their ecosystem. They really care about their modules. This is something that I want to use, rather than, you know, these are people who are just writing these really fancy things, but I have no idea how to use it. They're, you know, way above me. And, you know, that can be a little distancing, I think, for users. Juan asked where you can get the standard naming conventions. So when I say naming conventions, what I was kind of mentioning there was the more of the capitalization style, but it's other like little things that you'll notice, and there's not like a very hard thing to say, like, why do we use grep versus filter? But that's one of those. Most other languages do say filter in functional for their functional code, but Raku uses grep. And so whether you agree with that choice or not, I know some people really don't agree with it. I'm perfectly fine with it. Use grep as well, unless you have a really good reason not to. And in fact, even in that case, I would say make it an alias so that somebody could call either one. I do that with one of my modules because a lot of the base variable is pulling in data from somewhere else that has a whole mix of conventions. And I alias every single one of them to kebab case so that you can use kebab case if you're kind of in a more Raku oriented code. And if you're kind of having, you know, pulling in configuration files or things like that, then you can use the original names. And so it's kind of whichever one is easier for people. And so some of that, you know, outside of the kebab case versus camel case, things like that, the actual words that you use, that's just get a feel for it. And the more you use Raku code, the better you kind of get a feel for how should I name these things, right? We don't use get and set in Raku. It's sort of some of those things. I mean, occasionally we will, but there's got to be a good reason for it. It's not the default like in Java, where in Java you would say, no, you need to use get and set. That's the convention for them. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of there. All right, so then we have the meta6 file. And then this is kind of where we combine everything together. Put in the most important fields here are going to be your name, auth, version, and your provides. I think these are actually the only 4 that are required. But the other, somebody might correct me on that. But certainly these are the 4 that you need to get done first. So obviously your module name, the auth is basically just the ecosystem that's being used, followed by a colon, and then the username that's associated with it. And this can be used by, for instance, Zeph to ensure that it's actually downloading stuff from the correct area. There's a multitude of different reasons to use it. I think there actually has been some debate as to whether auth is for like authenticated or author or different things like that. But make sure to put it in. Don't put typos. I've done that a number of times, and Raku Land will yell at you and put like a big red box and say, this doesn't match. I don't know why I manage to do that all the time, but I do. Then we got the version, and this is actually there should be another quote mark there, but there's actually a proper version string. Oh, okay. Well, there we go. Ambiguous on Liz says that per Larry, it's auth is ambiguous on purpose. That sounds like one of the most Tim Toady things I've heard today. But in the version string, again, this is one of those things we try to encourage using semantic versioning, right? So first number up that if you've got breaking changes, the second number up it if you've got new features, third one doesn't really add new features, just more bug fixes. But of course, you can go down as far as you want. You don't have to use it. Again, Tim Toady. But kind of follow along with those conventions. It took me a little while to get used to it. I hadn't used them before. Then we have the provides. And if you remember earlier on, I mentioned there's actually a disconnect in the module naming that we'd have in the use statement here, like the use module name or use alias name, and the actual location in that lib directory. It's a many-to-many relationship going on between them. And this provides section actually defines what that is. And here you see I actually have two names, the module and the alias, that both point to the same file. So I've actually done this in one of my modules before because I had originally had one name for it. And as I started developing some other modules and they were clearly going to start to form a part of a family of modules, I said, no, I'm going to change the name, but I also don't want to screw with other people's code. So I kind of added in an alias in there, and just in my README file, I added in like a little deprecation notice that I was going to deprecate that name after, so long of time. And then what I can do is under that one, I can just add then a new module, point that alias one to a new module that just dies and explains why it died all of a sudden. Again, notice this is like path2 module file, which looks like it would be 4 sets of double colons, but you can just do 2, or you could actually just have module and alias. So it's very flexible there. Some other commonly used useful fields, we have author, and this is for your pretty print name, I guess you might call it. It's the one that you actually want to be recognized by. Most people put a full name in there. You can put full name with nicknames, whatever you want, but it is, and I think this is really great, it is defined as an array, not as a single string. So if you have multiple people working on a project, you can give them all credit right here. Now, only in that auth one, you just get the one name because that's the source, the authoritative source. And there's another version that that auth could also be used for. Then we have the license. Use this one from SPDX. And if it's not defined, there's ways that you can specify it more. I think I'm about to be told that I'm running low on time. We have API, by default is 0 if it's not included. Then we have the tags. This might be stuff that people will search for. You got descriptions, pretty straightforward. And then we have depends, build depends, and build test. And these 3 are where you list modules that you need to have your module work. The depends is stuff that's needed at runtime. So my datetime format module requires international CLDR. And so it says depends on that. Sometimes you only need a module at build time or when you're testing. And so you can have those only imported for those times, and that way they don't need to get loaded in at runtime. Again, it's best to fully, give them a full string in there. Yes, you should also put an API. Thank you for that, Radim. Some other stuff we've got here is the Raku or Perl is still technically in there. I don't think it's been officially deprecated, but it's there. And that's just for the version. And again, this is a full version string, so you can do 6.d plus, and then it'll let you do it on any version from 6.d or higher, or you can just do 6.d and it'll only run it on that. And or I guess you could do 5. I don't know. Can we do 5 in there? I don't know if we're still allowed to do that. I guess then it's not a Raku module at that point. Then we have a source URL where you can find this at. I think this was historic. I don't know if this is actually used in Fez, to be honest. I think this is only used for the P6 ecosystem. Meta version defines the version of the Meta 6 file. There's only one version right now, so it's 0. Production defines it as being available, ready, production ready. So normally when you push this out, that should be true. Support is one I don't see used hardly at all, and maybe we need to start using it a little bit more. I think it's got some interesting things. For instance, we can say support, have a mailing list, the bug tracker, the IRC. It even was proposed that you could have a phone number to call for support. I don't know who actually calls phone. Okay, maybe in the corporate world they do that, but I certainly haven't called anyone on the phone for help with Raku yet. But that was all set up to kind of be in there to give other information, and it's not an exhaustive one. It's set up, designed to allow for more ones in there. All right, last thing, and I know I'm running a little short on time here, but we have the ecosystems, and this is where we actually put our modules in. We have CPAN, which has been deprecated, right? This comes from our Perl heritage. CPAN was great. It fulfilled a good function back in the day. I think it still does for Perl. But one of its key problems was the way that it handled namespacing. And remember, I mentioned that you can have these modules that have the same name, but are written by different authors. And in CPAN, that would not have been allowed. And so, for instance, when I first did my module, international, I can't remember which one I did. I think it was international format date time or something like that. The moment I published that, if I was the first one in CPAN to publish it, I would instantly get the international namespace and then the format namespace under the international one, which meant that nobody could do 2 of them. And oh, really? Okay, I did not realize that the Raku that had that. Okay, so Liz has corrected me. Apparently, Raku on CPAN did allow multiple names for different authors, but anyway, that CPAN is the old one. It's been deprecated, so don't use it. I don't think anybody's really used CPAN in quite some time, so I don't think anybody. This is one, but you might occasionally see somebody who has a CPAN module. I know on Raku land I've seen a couple. Then we've got P6C. This was our. It actually worked fairly well, I think, for the time, for several years on GitHub. And we had a gigantic list, just a text file that listed all those Git links to every single module in the ecosystem. And, it was complicated, or not complicated, but it was, I think, too easy for people to edit those files. It didn't have good version tracking. It wasn't like CPAN. CPAN would actually keep track of the module files so that people could install older versions, things like that. That wasn't available with P6C. And so while it was a really great intermediate solution transitioning us from CPAN, it wasn't perfect. So now we have Fez, and this is the future. And I think even since I last gave this talk about a month ago, many more people have moved their modules over from P6C to Fez. So what is Fez, or what's different about it? Oops, sorry. What's different about it? This is done through, I think it was Nick and Tony built this. It is designed to kind of solve all of those old problems. How do you keep track of older versions of it so that, if somebody pulls their module off of GitHub, it doesn't break the entire ecosystem? How do we, kind of ensure some best practices, making sure that there's at least a version number, in the module and some other things like that. And you know, it was built really from the ground up to handle all of our Raku stuff. I'm hoping at some point one of the two of them will give a really detailed talk about the whole architecture and all the innards of it. I haven't seen the innards of it, so that's why I'm kind of giving a very shallow view of it. But 0 to 60 in a few lines. You just type in Zeph install Fez, and it'll pop this out. And it's kind of cool they have it, you know, popping out in the error code as a warning as it's building to give you all that information on how to use it. Then you type in Fez register if you've never used this before. And you can kind of see there on screen what it'll look like. It'll say, give me your email, give me your username, give me a password. It'll register you, and then you log yourself in. And now you don't have to log yourself in anymore, unless you move to like a new machine or something like that. It'll ask you to kind of put in some other information about you, your meta info. Then switch to your the directory of your module. Do Fez Check Build, which I found out is not actually required. Apparently, I thought it was. And oh, Liz said it asks for reauthentication once per month now. And it will say, hey, everything looks great. Or like in this case, it'll say, hey, you have this file in your resources folder and it's not listed in your Meta6 file. Maybe you should double check some stuff here. So it does at least some rudimentary, you know, checking for a well-formed module. And when I gave this talk, I think I misspoke the last time and I said that it would not, if you had some issues, it wouldn't even like make you fix them or whatever. And I was told, no, you can just upload, it'd be fine. And then you Fez upload, and there you go, it's all done. And your module's on the ecosystem. And this whole process, I did it for one of my, when I first got on there, it took 20 seconds, 30 seconds maybe. I mean, it was incredibly fast. Certainly much faster than, as Liz pointed out, getting onto CPAN. Getting a pause account, it takes a while. Yes, Sally, the check build is basically a linting process. And maybe down the road, they'll get a lot more in there, or somebody will write a module that does more intensive linting. But it's a very straightforward one. Another thing you might want to do if you do this, echo sdist to your git ignore, because it does add that file into your one. And a couple other commands. You got Fez login. If you get logged out, Fez meta will let you update your meta information, reset password, straightforward, and remove, right? Again, fairly straightforward there. Then to use your modules, this I think we're all familiar with, right? But I just do it for completeness sake in the presentation. Zeph, your module name, right? Again, adding in much more specific information if that's pertinent to you. If you're adding in the auth and the versions and things like that. Or of course, when you're doing your tests, you can also just go into your directory and say Zeph install dot, and that can get you a whole check through that process. And then in your Raku code, just use the module, and thus we have profit for you and others. So, like I said, I know I ran over, I apologize. But any questions or comments? Liz was giving really good comments in the chat there. Okay, nitpicks, whatever, same thing. They're good information there. All right, well, I guess if there's no talks, like I said, as you're writing your modules, just try to keep all this stuff in mind. I know it's a lot to think about, but I think if we go, we can get some really nice modules that will really help attract people to Raku.